Marantz's Stereo 70S isn't a traditional audiophile integrated amplifier. It's an AV receiver that only works in stereo. And in this video, I'm going to explain what the Stereo 70S can do for you, but with the Audiolab 6000A Play providing context.
This episode is brought to you by Eversolo, makers of the DMP A6 music streamer and DAC. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
Welcome back, everybody. No, Marantz's new Stereo 70S isn't really what we might call in the hi-fi world an integrated amplifier. Technically, it's a 75 watt per channel AV receiver, but with only 2 channels of loudspeaker output. And as we might expect from an AV receiver, it has 6 HDMI inputs, 3 of which are 8K capable, and we access the Marantz's internal DAC via HDMI ARC, Toslink or coax, as well as the internal HEOS streaming module. Then there's an Phono input, 2 subwoofer outputs, a headphone output, and obviously 2 sets of loudspeaker outputs. I say obviously, it's not really obvious, is it? But 2 sets, so you can have a zone A and a zone B. And all this can be yours for €1,000. Not a cent more, not a cent less. Now, many of you will want to ask, I think, is the Stereo 70S the best integrated amplifier / AV receiver in stereo that you can buy for €1,000? And when I'm presented with this question, I often think, best for whom? Because we have to ask, what kind of music do they enjoy? What type of sound quality do they enjoy? Do they prefer a lit up and lean presentation, or do they prefer a sound that heads more towards a fleshier sound but a bit more sedated in the treble? Because the Marantz sits mostly in the latter camp. And then we also have to ask, how much would the attached loudspeaker influence the end result? And also, what would a best amplifier's feature set look like? But let's say we can answer all of these questions and we still want to know what's best. Unless we get pretty much every €1,000 or thereabouts integrated amplifier here for a super test and then run them with a range of price appropriate speakers, we still wouldn't know for sure. Now, no single reviewer on the planet has the time for a super test, and I don't think many manufacturers would loan out their gear to take part. I think many of them would be somewhat risk averse because let's say you've got 10 candidates, only 1 can be a winner, so 9 will be perceived by the audience as losers. So the odds are sort of stacked against most manufacturers in the super test realm. So for me, side-by-side comparisons are the next best thing because they cut us a single slice from the super test cake, where 2 comparable products are in the same place at the same time. Now, €1,000 integrated that I've enjoyed very much these past 2 years is Audiolab's 6000A Play, and it will provide the side-by-side context for this Marantz video. And a bit like the 6000A Play, the Stereo 70S is what I would call a tank of an amplifier whose power-on relay clicks have a very reassuring thunk to them. And even though build quality is similar between these 2 amps, the input selector on the Marantz, to me, it feels a bit cheap, whilst the volume control, I think, yeah, it's reassuringly stiff, if nothing else. Now, back with the Audiolab, it has an internal DAC and it does streaming, albeit with the well-known handicap of DTS Play-Fi. Now, I always have a WiiM streamer hooked into the Audiolab's coax socket because the Toslink is already occupied by my Samsung TV's Toslink output. There is no HDMI ARC on the 6000A Play, but there is HDMI ARC on the Stereo 70S. And I think, as I've said many times before, the real value of HDMI ARC is in its messaging, because many moms and dads already know that HDMI ARC allows them to park their hi-fi remote in favour of their TVs. And to them, Toslink is an oddball legacy connection with the Apple TV 4K's remote learning capabilities a complete unknown. That's a very little known feature which is exclusive to the Apple TV 4K. Now the Marantz also has a coaxial input and a Toslink input into which I hooked a CD transport. But just like the Audiolab, the Marantz has no USB input. And for that we would need to use an interceding USB split-off converter like the Topping D10S. Both amplifiers offer simple front panel displays, but because the Marantz is technically an AV receiver, we can view its internal menu structure on the TV via its HDMI output. And this makes, for me, the Stereo 70S a whole lot easier to manage, mainly because there's more going on inside the Marantz than the Audiolab, certainly from a functional point of view. So on streaming functionality, the Marantz wins out, and I think pretty easily. And not because I'm a huge fan of HEOS necessarily, because I'm really not. It's okay, but it's not what I would call amazing, especially when sat next to Roon or Plex. But even after its recent visual refresh, HEOS's UX, I think, remains what I would call serviceable. And its developers have still to add Qobuz to the list of streaming service integrations. For now, at least, we must be content with Tidal, Deezer, SoundCloud, and Amazon Music /HD. So during my testing, I streamed Roon to the Marantz's AirPlay input and occasionally used Spotify Connect. But the Marantz's HDMI visual output also allows us to put a now playing screen on the TV. Now both amplifiers can run subwoofers, but there's no bass management system on the Audiolab to specify a crossover point, and there is in the Marantz. In fact, the Marantz has two subwoofer outputs with obviously basic bass management for low pass filtering, and you select that in the settings pane, either the settings pane on the little sort of circular display on the front of the amp or on the TV itself. And the subwoofer options menu also gives us some subwoofer gain settings, and that's great if we don't feel like getting out of our seats to adjust the gain on the back of the sub. So let's talk about sound quality, but without the sub in play. Now the Audiolab threatens 50 watts per channel into 8 ohms, but the Marantz promises 50% more output power, so 75 watts per channel into 8 ohms. Now why does that matter? Well, as a very, very extremely general rule of thumb, more power elevates the point at which distortion can enter the fray. However, despite their spec sheet ratings, neither amp sounds gruntier than the other when listening to Monolake's Hong Kong. Now that was with a pair of Pro-Ject Speaker Box 5 S2 loudspeakers, little two-way stand mount. And when swapping the Pro-Ject out for the KEF R3 Meta, the Marantz's power output advantage begins to show up. Its low end is slightly punchier than the Audiolab's. And sticking with the KEF loudspeakers, neither of these two Class A/B amplifiers, the Marantz and the Audiolab, show any hint of strain when going kind of loud, at least over 90 dB in the seat, when listening to the Mountain Goats' Jenny from Thebes. And we can't say that about the WiiM AMP, because it does start to strain as you crank the volume with the KEF R3 Meta. And even though I think the Audiolab sounds a tad smoother and a little richer than the Marantz, with either speaker, the Marantz gives us a little more mid-range transparency, a little more low-end attack, and better top-end extension. And that's when listening to the Blue Aeroplanes' Swagger or Aphex Twins Analord series. Having said that, as usual, know that the sound quality differences between the Audiolab and the Marantz, they're small enough that most people would be happy with the sound of either amp. I'll say a quick word about phono staging here. Neither amplifier's internal phono input is what we would call remarkable. They are both bested by an iFi Zen Phono, which sells for around €200. And I think, as always, or as is often the case, an integrated amplifier's internal phono stage is best seen as a convenience feature to get you up and running with vinyl. And if it's not, you can bet your life that the manufacturer is going to make a big song and dance about how it's got all these discrete components or how it was designed in this way or that way. And neither Audiolab nor Marantz make a big deal about their phono stage, and I don't think they sound, well, they sound fine. It's okay to get up and running, but like I say, the iFi gives you a better result. And it's the same with the headphone sockets on the front panel. They're there to get you up and running, not replace a dedicated headphone amplifier. So even a cheapie from the likes of Shit or iFi or Topping will sound more substantial, especially with thirstier headphones. So what you don't know, you don't miss. But it should also be noted that the Marantz Stereo 70S has a DAB Plus radio feature and an FM radio and a backlit remote control wand, which I think is a super nice touch. And the Audiolab has neither of these. Now, cameraman Olaf calls these kinds of big, long remotes, he calls them dad remotes, which I think is just perfect. It's just a great way to describe what they are. You know, the dads that have that sort of thing that folds over the arm of the chair with the slots for the remotes in this side. I mean, if I ever get one of those, please pull me aside and tell me to sort myself out. But those minor additions are not why I am switching from the Audiolab to the Marantz as my €1,000 integrated amplifier of choice. I'm switching because the Stereo 70's sound better meets my needs or my expectations. It's slightly more lit up and slightly more microdynamically alert than the 6000A Play, while still sitting at the fleshier and mellow end of the sonic spectrum. And for context here, the Marantz to me sounds meatier and more organic than the WiiM AMP, but it offers a little more of the WiiM's pep than the Audiolab. Crucially, the Marantz is best for me and my tastes in sound when listening to music that I like. That's what this video is all about. But sound quality isn't the only reason why I'm switching from the Audiolab to the Marantz. The HEOS streaming platform, yes, it's better than Play-Fi, but not by much. I mean, we get AirPlay for Roon streaming and I find that very useful. And I think we should be grateful that HEOS isn't plagued by the gapped playback issues that Play-Fi is, and it doesn't have any of the weird workarounds that Play-Fi does. I mean, transfer mode gets you out of gapped playback hell, but then it stops you from being able to search for the next album or the next song. That said, HEOS's streaming suite isn't as comprehensive as WiiM's, and in reality, I'll probably just bypass HEOS altogether with a WiiM Pro Plus, just as I do with the Audiolab at the moment. However, that still leaves the three main reasons why I'm switching from the Audiolab to the Marantz. And those are, number one, HDMI ARC, number two, bass management for when connecting a subwoofer, and number three, the HDMI output that puts the now playing screen on my TV. The Audiolab has none of this. Now, this won't be the last time we see the Marantz Stereo 70S this month. I'll also be using it to drive the Pro-Ject Speaker Box 5S2, God, what a mouthful, when we cover those loudspeakers in a few videos time. But if you like this video, please consider liking and subscribing down below, and also consider joining me on Patreon, where you'll find music playlists for every video that we've made in the past 3 years. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. Sorry, Olaf.